Margaret sat in the faded blue armchair they'd bought together 40 years ago, a cup of coffee clutched in her trembling hands. It was the same coffee Robert had always made for her each morning. 2 sugars, a whisper of cinnamon, just the way she'd loved it since their first day as husband and wife. The porcelain was cold against her fingers, the coffee untouched, her stomach knotted with an unyielding dread. Robert stood in the kitchen doorway, barefoot in the plaid pajamas she'd bought him last Christmas, that familiar lost look in his eyes. But this time it was different, emptier, more frightening, as if he were gazing right through her, into a place she couldn't reach. He stared for long seconds, his brow furrowed as if trying to decipher an impossible puzzle, as if she were an intruder in her own home. The wrinkles around his eyes, once etched by years of laughter at her jokes, now deepened with confusion and fear. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the recognition that never came, waiting for the morning smile that had greeted her for 5 decades, waiting for anything to suggest that the man of her life was still there within that familiar body. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a tremor of what it once was, the voice that had whispered "I love you" on their honeymoon in a small countryside inn, that had sung "Happy Birthday" for 50 consecutive years, that had promised in a small church to love her in sickness and in health, never imagining the sickness could be this cruel. "Could you tell me, who are you, and why are you in my house?" The silence that followed was louder than any shout, more painful than any argument they'd ever had, more devastating than any early marriage squabble. Margaret felt her world crumble. For the first time in 52 years of marriage, the man who had promised to love her forever was looking at her as if she were a complete stranger, an invader stealing the breakfast of her own life. But to truly understand this moment, the one that shattered her heart in 2, we must go back to the beginning. If you've ever cared for someone who forgot your name, leave a candle in the comments. Your story matters too. Margaret and Robert met on a sunny Sunday afternoon in October 1970. She was just 19, he 22, both too young to comprehend the kind of love that spans a lifetime. He worked in his father's workshop, repairing old cars on a cobblestone street. She passed that small garage every day on her way to college, always carrying a stack of books and the gardenia perfume she'd worn since she was 16. The scent of diesel oil mingling with her floral perfume became the soundtrack of their first love, of those initial curious glances that blossomed into sidewalk conversations, then invitations for soda at the corner diner. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at the neighborhood church. He promised, tears in his eyes and voice thick with emotion, to cherish her until death parted them, never imagining there were things worse than death, things that steal the person you love while their body still breathes beside you. Margaret wore her mother's dress, carefully altered by the local seamstress. Robert was immaculate in a borrowed suit from his older brother, nervous but radiant, like a man who knew exactly where he wanted to be for the rest of his life. For 5 full decades, Robert was the kind of husband who woke up 15 minutes before her to prepare her coffee exactly as she liked it. He knew she preferred scrambled eggs on Sundays and boiled during the week. He never, ever forgot to say, "Good night, my love," before sleep, even after silly arguments about money or raising the children. He memorized every detail about her, the way she twisted her hair when she was nervous studying for college exams, how she hummed old romantic songs softly while cooking on Sundays, and that she always cried during movies, even comedies, because she had a heart too tender for this world. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with nothing special on the calendar, that everything began to change, silently. Robert asked where the car keys were, for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Margaret laughed the first time, thought it was distraction the second, but a cold shiver ran down her spine the third. When he asked their granddaughter's name for the 5th time that same week, the little 6-year-old girl he adored and spoiled every weekend, a chill coursed through her body. This wasn't just age, not common forgetfulness. It was something that would steal not only his memories, but also, piece by piece, day after day, memory by memory, the only love of her life. If you also miss a voice that no longer remembers yours, comment, "I hear you," and tell us what city and country you're watching this story from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support more stories like this. The initial lapses seemed innocent, almost adorable in their cruel simplicity. Robert began calling her Lovely instead of Margaret, and she forced herself to believe it was just a new, affectionate nickname, a late-life romance in their 70s. He'd ask what day of the week it was. Even after looking at the kitchen calendar, she meticulously updated with family events in red pen. He'd misplace his reading glasses, search for keys already in his hand, and sometimes stand motionless in the living room, like a statue, as if he'd lost the thread of some vital thought he could never quite retrieve. Margaret became an expert at disguising the deterioration, an actress playing the most challenging role of her life. When he asked for the name of the street they'd lived on for over 30 years, raising children and accumulating memories in every room, she'd answer naturally, as if it were the first time he'd asked, as if it were perfectly normal for a man to forget his own address. When he stood for 15 minutes under a cold shower, unable to remember how to adjust the water temperature, she'd slip into the bathroom discreetly and fix it for him, pretending she was just grabbing a clean towel. She convinced herself that true love was precisely this, protecting the dignity of the one you love, even as everything around you crumbles in slow motion, even as you feel your own sanity slipping with the person who was always your emotional anchor. Margaret became the guardian not only of his routine, but also of the illusion that everything was normal, that they were simply becoming more forgetful with age, like any 70-year-old couple. Their children started noticing the changes during Sunday visits. David, the eldest, always pragmatic like his father, suggested it was just old age and that everyone forgets things sometimes, especially after retirement when the rigid work routine ends. Sarah, the youngest, became genuinely worried when her father didn't remember her drastic new haircut from the previous week, a cut she'd gotten specifically to show them. Margaret defended her husband like a lioness protecting her wounded cubs. "You don't understand. He's just tired. 50 years of hard work in the shop takes its toll on body and mind." But there were moments of crystalline clarity that broke her heart more cruelly than any forgetting. Robert would wake some mornings and look at her as he had in their early dating days, with that passionate gaze of a young man discovering love, whispering, "Good morning, my love," with that crooked smile that had melted her since she was 19. In these precious, rare moments, Margaret clung to the desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could weather this storm together, hand in hand, as they had with all of life's difficulties. She didn't know that each moment of lucidity was a disguised farewell, a goodbye she couldn't recognize. It was on an ordinary Thursday, during their usual breakfast, that the moment she would carry forever happened. Robert looked directly into her eyes, with a clarity he hadn't shown in weeks, and said with absolute certainty, "Margaret, you are the love of my life. Promise me you'll never leave me even if I forget your name. Promise you'll stay by my side even if I can no longer recognize your face." She promised, tears streaming down her face, holding his trembling hands, unaware that this would be the last time he spoke her name with such love and recognition, the last time he truly saw her as the woman he chose to share his entire life with. A week later, on a morning that began like any other when she entered the living room, with the coffee tray she always prepared for them to share, Robert looked at her with that strange, frightened expression, as if seeing a ghost. His voice full of suspicion, he asked, "Excuse me, who are you, and what are you doing in my house?" Margaret felt as if the world had stopped spinning at that exact moment. She smiled through the tears that stubbornly welled up, served the coffee with shaking hands, and answered with the most loving voice she could muster. "I'm just someone who loves you very much, Robert." Do you remember the last time someone special said your name? Write it here before that memory fades too. Margaret discovered that caring for someone with advanced Alzheimer's is like living in a constant state of military alert, where the enemy is invisible and unpredictable, always striking when you least expect it. Robert began to completely confuse day and night, waking at 2 in the morning, convinced he needed to get dressed and go to work at the shop he'd sold 15 years prior, or at 5 in the afternoon, insisting it was time for bed and that someone had stolen his night. She learned to set silent alarms to check on him every 2 hours, transforming her own nights into an endless cycle of micro-sleeps interrupted by constant panic. Sleep became an impossible luxury she could no longer afford, a basic right revoked the moment she committed to caring for him alone. Margaret developed an internal radar that woke her whenever Robert shifted differently in bed, when his breathing changed rhythm, or when he simply became too quiet for too long. She began to sleep with one ear always alert, in a kind of maternal sleep she hadn't even experienced when their children were infants. The medication routine became an exact, obsessive science that completely dominated her life. 8 different pills distributed at 4 specific times of day, each with its own complicated instructions, with food, without food, away from dairy, never with orange juice. Margaret plastered handwritten reminders on every mirror in the house, set 5 different alarms on her phone with distinct tones for each medication, and even then, sometimes she'd stand in the kitchen wondering if she'd given the 2 o'clock dose or just obsessively thought about giving it. She started taking detailed notes in a blue notebook, as if her own memory were also failing under the overwhelming weight of constant responsibility. Nights were the most terrifying moments of the entire process. Robert would wake screaming with genuine terror, convinced there were dangerous strangers hidden in the closet or under the bed, or that thieves had invaded the house and were stealing his imaginary tools. Other times, he would simply vanish from the bed like a silent ghost, and Margaret would find him in the kitchen trying to make coffee for the workshop employees at 3 in the morning, or in the garage looking for cars that needed repair before dawn. She learned to calm him without ever contradicting his distorted perceptions, pretending there really were employees waiting for coffee or cars needing repair, but that everything could calmly wait until the next day. Lifelong friends gradually faded away, as if dissolving into thin air. Visits drastically decreased when Robert stopped recognizing people he'd known for decades, when he began treating old friends as complete strangers, or worse, as potential threats to be expelled from his home. Neighbors greeted Margaret on the street with that pitying, embarrassed smile she'd learned to recognize and profoundly hate. The smile of someone who feels sorry but doesn't want to get too involved with another's tragedy, someone secretly grateful not to be in the same situation. She felt more alone than she ever imagined a human could feel, a loneliness that physically hurt, even with someone beside her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a specific, cruel solitude, the loneliness of talking to herself, of making all decisions alone, of carrying all fears alone, while caring for someone who could no longer be an emotional companion. What hurt most deeply was the complete and irreversible inversion of the roles that had defined their relationship for half a century. Margaret found herself bathing the man who once carried her in his arms on their honeymoon, choosing and dressing the clothes for someone who had always been elegant and particular about his appearance, cutting food into small pieces for the man who used to cook for her every Sunday with pride and care. It was as if she had become her own husband's mother, but without that instinctive natural love a mother feels. It was love learned through force, love consciously chosen every day, love that hurt more than it healed. Margaret began to completely lose herself, forgetting her own identity. She'd forget to eat entire meals, to take regular showers, to comb her hair or change her clothes. Some mornings, she'd look in the bathroom mirror and not recognize the tired, aged woman staring back with deep, dull eyes. If you've spent entire nights awake for someone who didn't even know you were there, this part is for you. The paranoia arrived like a devastating, unexpected storm, transforming Robert into the complete opposite of the gentleman she had loved for 5 decades. He systematically began accusing Margaret of stealing his most precious things, of deliberately hiding important documents, of secretly conspiring against him with imaginary people who supposedly entered the house during the night. The woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to caring for him, who had sacrificed her teaching career to always be available, now was seen as a dangerous criminal in his eyes. "You're not my wife," he screamed with frightening rage one Sunday morning that should have been peaceful, violently pushing away the plate of scrambled eggs she had prepared exactly how he liked them for 50 years, with melted cheese and a sprinkle of oregano. "My real wife would never do this to me. Where have you hidden my Margaret?" The words were like sharp knives being repeatedly plunged into her chest, each syllable laden with distrust and hatred directed at the wrong person. She was Margaret. She had always been Margaret. She had never been anything but Margaret. But for him, the true Margaret had mysteriously vanished, and all that remained was a cruel impostor pretending to be his wife. The children, visiting less frequently each month, began to openly question her decisions and competence as a caregiver. David, always practical and direct as a blade, suggested in a tense kitchen conversation that perhaps it was finally time to seriously consider a specialized nursing home, that Margaret clearly could no longer adequately handle the complex and dangerous situation. Sarah arrived one afternoon and found Robert visibly agitated with a purple bruise on his right arm, and immediately assumed her mother had been negligent or even physically abusive. Margaret tried to patiently explain that he had fallen alone while trying to escape the house during a confused early morning, but saw in her own children's eyes that terrible shadow of doubt that destroyed her completely from within. The government social worker appeared on a rainy Tuesday in April, unannounced, with a clipboard full of forms and a professionally suspicious gaze. Someone? Margaret never managed to discover exactly who, but suspected it had been one of the children, had filed an official complaint of possible elder abuse. Robert, in one of his most confused and paranoid moments, had told a concerned neighbor in detail that the strange woman living in my house abuses me every day and steals my pension money to buy things for herself. Margaret watched in terrified silence as the social worker methodically examined each room of the house, asking direct and embarrassing questions about unexplained bruises, about the correct administration of prescribed medications, about her actual ability to provide adequate care for a person in such an advanced state of dementia. "Mrs. Margaret," the public official said with a professionally cold and distant tone, "Mr. Robert shows visible signs of psychological agitation and some physical injuries that need to be investigated. We need to assess if this home environment is truly suitable and safe for him." Margaret felt the ground literally disappear beneath her feet at that moment. 52 years entirely dedicated to caring for the same person, building an entire life around her love for him, and now she was officially suspected of mistreating him. The unconditional love she felt for Robert was being used as evidence against her, as proof that she was not competent enough to love him in the correct and appropriate way. That silent, cold night, after the social worker left with bureaucratic promises to closely monitor the case's development, Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed where Robert slept restlessly, making strange noises with his mouth. She intently watched the face of the man she had loved her entire adult life, now permanently marked by confusion, fear, and distrust towards her. For the first time since it all began, she seriously considered giving up everything. Perhaps the children were right in their concerns. Perhaps she really could no longer adequately care for him. Perhaps love was not enough to overcome such a devastating and relentless disease. She wrote a long letter that sleepless night, a letter she never had the courage to send, but one she needed to write to keep from going completely insane. If you've ever been blamed just for loving too much, share it here in the comments. This space is safe for you. Margaret made the most painful decision of her life on a hazy April morning, when she finally admitted to herself that her love was hurting more than helping. She hired Rosa, a 50-year-old professional caregiver, and deliberately stepped back from the daily routine of caring for Robert. It wasn't complete abandonment. She continued living in the same house, paying all the medical bills, overseeing every detail of his care. But she consciously stopped being the person who administered his medicine, who bathed him, who desperately tried to explain who she was every morning. She transformed into a distant, ghostly presence in her own home, observing from afar as a stranger cared for the man she had loved for over half a century. It was a strange and cruel form of grief, mourning someone who still breathed in the next room, who still woke every morning, but who no longer had any emotional connection with her. Rosa was a kind, experienced, and infinitely patient woman who treated Robert with that professional patience Margaret had completely lost after years of being accused of crimes she never committed. Margaret watched with a mixture of relief and jealousy as her husband accepted the intimate care of a complete stranger with more ease and less resistance than he had ever accepted hers in recent months. It was ironic and devastatingly painful to realize that the profound love she felt for him had become the greatest obstacle to adequately caring for him. Robert deteriorated dramatically and much faster without the emotional stress of constantly trying to remember who Margaret was or how to react to her presence. He almost completely stopped speaking, communicating only through confused gestures and incomprehensible sounds, and spent entire hours sitting in the living room armchair, staring fixedly out the window, as if eternally waiting for someone very important he knew would never arrive. Margaret watched this accelerated deterioration from a safe distance, feeling simultaneously like an intruder in her own life, and like someone watching the end of a tragic film she knew by heart, but over which she no longer had any influence or control. It was on a sunny Sunday in May, while Rosa was off visiting the family and Margaret was temporarily caring for Robert alone for the first time in weeks, that something completely inexplicable and magical happened. She was methodically organizing the week's medications in the kitchen when she found an old, yellowed photograph that had fallen and been hidden behind the nightstand during a cleaning. It was a photo of the two of them at her graduation dance in 1971, both incredibly young and radiant, he in a rented tuxedo and she in the blue dress her mother had specially sewn for the occasion. The photo was yellowed at the edges and a bit faded by time, but the passionate smiles of the two young people were even brighter than the memory she held of that day. Margaret couldn't resist the temptation and took the photograph to show Robert, without any expectation of a reaction, simply moved by a nostalgic impulse she couldn't control. Robert took the photo with his trembling, arthritic hands and stared in complete silence for long minutes that felt like hours. Margaret nervously watched every micro-expression on his face, searching for any sign of recognition or emotional connection. Then, gradually, tears began to stream down his wrinkled face, silent tears that came from somewhere very deep, long before he could form any conscious word or thought. He slowly raised his eyes to Margaret, still not recognizing her as his wife, but there was something profoundly different in that gaze. It was as if some very old and hidden part of his soul had been touched by something familiar. "This young lady in the photo," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse, pointing to the young Margaret in the photograph. "This young lady in the photo," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse, pointing to the young Margaret in the photograph. "She was very beautiful, I think I loved her very much." He looked directly into Margaret's eyes, not recognizing her as the same person in the photo, but there was a sweetness in his voice she hadn't heard in months. "Do you know where she is now? I would really like to see her again." Margaret felt her heart break and mend at the same time. He didn't know she was that young woman in the photo, couldn't connect the 72-year-old woman to the radiant 19-year-old girl, but something within him still held love for that version of herself. It was as if love had survived the ruins of memory, existing somewhere deeper than names and faces, stronger than the disease could reach. "She's right here," Margaret replied, her voice choked, gently touching his hand over the photograph. "She never left. She just got a little older, but her love for you, that never changed one bit." Robert continued to cry, without exactly understanding why, but feeling something warm and familiar moving within his chest, as if a forgotten part of himself had temporarily returned home. He held Margaret's hand, not as a husband, but as someone who instinctively recognized a safe and caring person, and they sat there in silence, two strangers connected by a love that transcended memory and logic. Margaret realized that perhaps this was the purest form of love she had ever experienced, loving someone who doesn't know who you are, caring for someone who cannot reciprocate, remaining by the side of someone who can no longer recognize your presence, but who can still feel, somewhere very deep in their soul, the familiar texture of true affection. Do you believe love can endure, even when memory fades? Share this story with someone who still believes. Margaret made a decision the following week that would forever change how she viewed that painful journey. She began recording short videos on her phone, documenting not Robert's illness, but the moments when a spark of the person he once was still shone through the confusion and forgetting. These weren't technical or medical videos. They were intimate records of humanity bravely resisting deterioration. She recorded Robert humming a 70s song whose lyrics he couldn't recall, but whose rhythm still lived in some untouched part of his bodily memory. She recorded the moment he genuinely laughed at a joke she told, even without understanding the context or remembering who she was. She recorded his hands, still skillful and tender, automatically stroking a neighbor's cat that appeared at the window, as if 50 years of feeding stray animals had created an instinct deeper than the disease could erase. The children were initially uncomfortable with the video idea, thinking it was a morbid way to cling to the past, but Margaret patiently explained that she wasn't recording to deny the reality of the illness. She was documenting the parts of Robert that still resisted, still existed, still deserved to be celebrated and remembered. "You'll be grateful to have these when he's gone," she said with a quiet certainty she didn't know where it came from. Margaret also began writing letters to Robert, letters he could never read or comprehend, but which she needed to write to process the enormity of what they were living through together. They were letters of pure, unconditional love, letters telling stories of the life they built together, reminding him who he was before the disease stole all the words from his mouth. "My dearest Robert," she wrote one rainy June afternoon, "today you looked at me as if I were the most beautiful woman in the world, even without knowing my name. It was exactly the same look as when we were young and you saw me cross the street towards your father's workshop. The love is still there, my dear, perhaps even purer now, because it doesn't depend on memories or expectations. It depends only on something very deep that the disease couldn't touch." She created a special album with photos of their entire life together, each page carefully organized chronologically, with handwritten captions telling the story that the images alone could no longer convey. It wasn't for Robert. He could no longer process complex visual narratives. It was for herself, for their children, for future grandchildren who would need to know that their grandfather was much more than the disease that defined him in his final years. The most surprising discovery was that caring for Robert had taught her a new form of love she never imagined existed. It was love stripped of expectations, of reciprocity, of recognition or gratitude. It was love as a daily decision to remain present for someone who could no longer consciously reciprocate that presence. Love as an action repeated every day, regardless of emotional response. Margaret realized she had become a different person through that devastating experience. She was stronger, more compassionate, more connected with what truly mattered in human life. She had developed a supernatural patience, an ability to find joy in tiny gestures, a profound understanding of the simultaneous fragility and resilience of the human condition. On one particularly difficult night, when Robert was especially agitated and confused, she sat beside his bed and said aloud, "Robert, I don't know if you can understand me, but I want you to know that it was an enormous honor to love you. Even like this, even without you knowing who I am, it was the hardest and most beautiful thing I've ever done in my life. If I could choose again, I would choose you again. I would choose to stay by your side again. I would choose to go through all of this again." She didn't know if he understood the words, but she saw an expression of peace settle on his face, as if some very deep part of him had received exactly the message it needed to hear. If you care for someone who no longer knows you exist, share this story. In every city, there's an invisible caregiver, and their love deserves to be remembered. Margaret found a yellowed piece of paper in Robert's desk drawer 3 months after he died, peacefully on a September morning, surrounded by her and their children. It was a note he had written in his trembling hand, already compromised by the disease, likely in the early stages of Alzheimer's, when he could still form complete and coherent thoughts. "Margaret," the note read in the almost childlike script of someone battling their own body, "if I ever forget your name, promise you'll remember for both of us. Promise you won't let me forget that I was loved. Promise you'll keep our story when I can no longer tell it. I love you more than anything in this life. Your Robert." She carefully folded the paper and placed it inside her Bible, on the page of Psalm 23 that they had read together on their wedding day. Some memories may vanish like leaves carried by the wind, but others are etched in places that even the cruelest disease cannot erase. Memory may fade, but sometimes love remains to remember who we are.